Boom. All right. We have Marc and Sam and myself. What's up, y'all?
Howdy. What's going on, man?
How's
Nothing
it
much.
going?
I'm great. I would love to hear about updates from y'all before we dive into the topic for today.
Sam, start us off.
Oh, had a little rough patch the last few weeks. Got sick a few times. Hurt my toes. I was trying to live up to some trampoline and parkour impressive athletes I was hanging out with and smashed them into a wall really badly and really hurt like the lower portion of my big toes. So currently out of commission for running and just trying to get back in shape. How about you, Marc?
Were you at a gym or are you just like outside hopping over potted plants and like stubbed your toe?
So if you envision the scene from The Office where they're doing parkour, that is basically it, but it was at a facility. Yeah.
Okay. Like you weren't like jumping over those big red balls in front of targets and like...
No, I was at a place called Air House. So it's like a indoor parkour facility and a ton of trampolines set up.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm doing all right. I've been back home for the past 5 days. It feels good. I was traveling for 2 weeks, pretty nonstop. So yeah, I like my routine. So it's nice to be home and getting back into my routine.
Nice.
How about you, Chris? What's going on?
Just working. I went snowshoeing for the first time a few weeks ago, which was great. Did it back to back. And I'm a fan. I feel like the potential risks of velocity sports like snowboarding and skiing, I don't want to take those risks because I never did it as a kid. And I really like the slow nature of snowshoeing. It's just like hiking, but bulkier. I know Tony's all about it. Marc seems skeptical, but I had a great time. I'd do it again.
Yeah, Tony and his wife Steph do it. And I don't have any interest. No offense to anybody who likes snowshoeing. You know, we did cross-country skiing in Kelowna on a trail. That also wasn't for me. I prefer the velocity, Chris. I like the adrenaline. If I'm going to walk, I'd rather just walk without the bulkiness. Once again, if you like it, hey, more power to you.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll pick up skiing and snowboarding. I'm in a place that's primed for it, so we'll see. I've only been skiing once, and it was on a hill in Michigan, but I learned how to pizza, and that's about it. So maybe at some point. All right, the topic for today and we're going to dive in a few things, but the primary topic is the Goldilocks Principle. And primarily the discussion will be about diving into what is the Goldilocks Principle, what's the story behind it, and then how is this utilized and conceptualized in a train and rehab format. But Marc or Sam, do y'all want to talk about some of the new apparel we have and when that may be coming out with the Goldilocks Principle?
Yes, we do have a new Goldilocks shirt. I'm wearing it. I don't know. Like, it's kind of hard to see. If you're watching the YouTube video, you know, you could probably see it. Let me get out of the way.
Boom.
So, yeah, those shirts just came out. So it's kind of cool. And, you know, like I wrote a blog on this and made a YouTube video on it. And the story of Goldilocks, and there's been a few different iterations of the story. It's changed over time. I'm sure there's even newer ones that have changed. But the one that most people that are probably familiar with is Goldilocks, young girl, goes into the home of these three bears. The three bears aren't home, and it's like, you know, a mama bear, a papa bear, and a baby bear. And she tries the different porridges that they left out. One is too hot, one is too cold, one is just right. And then she also tries out their chairs and their beds. And like, it's, you know, too hard, too soft, and just right. So when we say the Goldilocks principle as it applies to training or rehab. And I don't know if it's actually a principle, but it's just how we're framing this discussion. It's trying to find, rather than too hot or too cold or too hard or too soft, it's, trying to find the balance between too much and too little, to find the just right level of training or activity or whatever it may be as it relates to rehab, performance, training, etc.
So the first part we want to dive into is this concept of load, which can be viewed in a variety of different ways. And Sam, do you want to dive into the differentiating the different types of load? Because I think this will be the framework and base for a lot of the future discussions if we can kind of define terms early on here.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, the term load is just this arbitrary usage that we've applied to represent the accumulation of stress, essentially, where it's going to provide a representation of the spectrum of stressors that we will experience as humans. So things like physiological, psychological, mechanical, and we can generally view it from a individual session standpoint, so how we're feeling at the moment, or we can also look at it from multiple sessions or the accumulation across time. And there are different types of loads that we can separate it out to. Typically, it's broken down into two main options of either external load or internal, where external is essentially outside of yourself, being things like the amount of weight you lifted, the distance you ran, the minutes you played in the game, whereas internal is going to be things that you can measure that are typically more physiological, such as your heart rate, your blood lactate, or perceptual, like your RPE. So with that, we have these different measures that are both subjective and objective, with the example being RPE and heart rate being two different ways that we can measure intensity of load for a given activity, where RPE is a subjective rating, and it can give you a good representation of how the person feels about the load within an activity, whereas heart rate is a more objective measure of how stressed the body is in the respective activity. And when we look at that across different situations, for instance, a example of someone who is a cyclist or someone who's a runner, we can see that in some cases there will be a strong correlation between these two measures. For instance, as a cyclist increases their overall effort in the bout, so increasing wattage, we should see a appropriate match of RPE and heart rate. However, there can be things that disturb this relationship, such as the accumulation of fatigue across time, or psychological disturbances, like if you are going into a bout where you've just recently had an argument with your significant other, and these can play a factor into the subjective and objective matching. So overall, that's basically a overarching principle of the term load. Any other comments from you guys?
No, I think that leads into these two other theories and ways we can view the load and the variety of loads. So the envelope of function and physical stress theory, I don't know if we want to lump them together, Sam, or if we want to go in two separate bouts, but this envelope of function discusses loads and the variety of ways that they can impact us from an underloading and overloading perspective. Sam, do you want to initially discuss what the envelope of function is, and then we can kind of maybe give some examples that they utilized in the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term envelope of function comes from a physician, a researcher who is a really interesting individual if you dive into him. He did some fantastic research. For instance, he did a study where he had two of his colleagues actually go and do surgical assessment of his knee while he was not under anesthesia to understand if he could tell locations and degrees of symptoms with them probing around in his knee. Just wild to think about. Just interesting example. But he ended up coming to this term envelope of function, where he was evaluating different situations with his patients and trying to get a better understanding of why individuals who had changes on MRI, X-ray, or within surgical assessment had symptoms, whereas others did not, and trying to see if he could figure out a representation for this. And he came to envelope of function, which was basically trying to create a way that we could look at load and how much load a system can tolerate. So when we look at something like the knee, it can be viewed as a system, being able to accept, transfer, dissipate loads. And as we start to look into that, we can create a representation of the amount of load it can experience in a graph. So typically it's done where a vertical axis is created that is load. So at the bottom, no load. At the top, tons of load. Then we have a horizontal axis, which is to represent frequency or volume, where you have very little, so essentially a single time point, and then as far out as you want to go, such as hours or days. And on that graph, we can start to plot different examples. So a good one is sprinting, jogging, and walking, where we have sprinting at the left, so at the start of the load graph and minimum of the frequency. So you have this very high load activity, but very short frequency. Then you have jogging, which can be a medium load activity with a very long sustained frequency. And then you have walking, which is even lower in load and can be reasonably sustained indefinitely. So he created this so that he could start to look at where does an individual have the capacity to tolerate different loads at their different joints. And within this, he plotted these different levels in it. So as you work your way up in load at the different frequencies, you have a level called homeostasis, where it is a region of loading that is recoverable and repairable. And then as you start to exceed that, you get into supraphysiological overload, which starts to challenge the ability to adapt and recover. And then if you keep going past that, you get to structural failure, where tissue breaks down. And within this, you can look at different activities and plot them on there to sort of gain a better understanding. So for instance, if you were to look at a individual jumping and again, look at the knee, you could have someone who does a standing vertical jump and they're going to be probably within their homeostasis for that. Whereas they might do a depth jump from 2 meters and that starts to go into the supraphysiological. But then if they go up to 3 meters, then it goes into the breakdown. So it exceeds the tolerance of their tissues. And so this gives a general framework for understanding individuals' joints as how it was originally proposed, but it can be applied essentially to an individual, different tissues, because it's a framework to understand loading. And it's not a static concept. It is very dynamic, where as there are different stressors in your life, your envelope of function will go up or down for different activities. And it can be influenced by your sleep, your nutrition, your fatigue. All of these things contribute to where you're currently able to tolerate different stressors, essentially.
I'm curious, do either of y'all actually, when you've worked with patients, do you ever use that term or describe it? I've explained it more like this is your current ceiling and maybe we're a little bit too close to that, and ultimately we want to raise that ceiling and give you a little bit more space. But yeah, do either of you all actually use this terminology or similar concepts when describing it?
I've drawn out basically the envelope of function and explained it to people kind of how you were describing, but I've never, to my knowledge, said the word envelope of function to a patient.
I don't think I have either. There are some patients with a very like scientific mind, or they're very interested in that, and they might ask you questions that lead them to the title of this paper, or more about this paper, or more about this concept. So perhaps it's like come up in conversation, but I don't think I would ever describe it to somebody as their envelope of function.
Wasn't it, going back to when they were looking into his knee, was it like the suprapatellar fat pad that was the most painful? I wish they videotaped that. Just the whole situation. I think in the paper he was talking about the like expletives that he was using, but
yeah, it's like the patient jumped off the table, exclaiming nonverbal explicits or something.
Yeah. So there's that concept in theory, and it has very similar overlaps to a little bit later. Michael Mueller came up with physical stress theory. So Sam, do you want to discuss this concept and maybe the similarities and differences between the envelope of function and physical stress theory?
Yeah, essentially the envelope of function came out first, and then Mueller was inspired through his own experiences and then other research that was out, and came to the physical stress theory, which is a basically expanded version of envelope of function. I think the envelope of function still could have all the same parameters essentially. It just doesn't have it how it was originally written. So essentially physical stress being a force applied to a biological tissue. And then the concept is essentially that there's going to be an adaptive response of tissues to the respective stress applied. And this can be different kinds of adaptive responses. So in the physical stress theory, they have 5 different responses. Number 1 is maintenance, where there's a stress that is applied that is not exceeding or underloading, and everything is carried on forward. Then you have atrophy or decreased stress tolerance, where there is actually a insufficient amount of stress applied, and so then there is a decrease in tolerance for stress. Then in the opposite direction, you have increased stress tolerance, and that is where the capacity is increased to take more load. Then if you increase beyond that level, you start to get into injury, where there's a breakdown. And then finally, death. They went pretty extreme with that one. So it has a similar framework of the homeostasis and the superphysiological and then the breakdown. So those sort of match up. They expanded, including the decreased stress tolerance. And sometimes the decreased stress tolerance is called atrophy, and then the increased stress tolerance is called hypertrophy. So if you think of it from a muscular standpoint, that really makes sense. Where if someone has a steady stress applied, they're going to maintain the results. Whereas if they stop going to the gym, have bed rest, something like that, they're going to atrophy and decrease. Whereas if they challenge themselves beyond their current ability levels, but to a recoverable level, they will hypertrophy. And within this concept, stress can be applied in a singular activity, or it can be applied across time. So that's where we can see you might have something such as the bouts of jumping we discussed earlier, where each individual jumping bout might be within maintenance, might exceed maintenance, or it might be under maintenance, depending upon the individual's stress tolerance. And then you might also, or there will be also the alternative of a cumulative load, where you could look at it from a standpoint of a professional basketball athlete, where during their season, they will accumulate more and more. And at a certain point, it might exceed their tolerance for what was previously something that they could recover from. And then within this, it has the same sort of aspects where psychosocial factors, physiological factors will impact where your stress tolerance is. So if your sleep is impaired, it could lower it down. If you're taking corticosteroid medication, it could lower it down. And vice versa, you could have it elevated from appropriate factors. And one of the things that does differ, at least in the original papers with this, is an explanation of how we can apply it. Within Scott Dye's work, he didn't really expand into that, whereas Mueller gave examples early on discussing how we can provide modifications to rehab or activity modifications to help individuals basically come to a point where there's not excessive stress on the tissue, allowing things to desensitize, to calm down and recover. And then we can grade exposure and activity to increase the stress tolerance by manipulating intensity, volume, frequency, or execution.
I chatted with Michael Mueller a year or two ago in in grad school. I had him on my journal club, and I asked him the initial decision or idea to make this concept. And he said he was working with a ton of individuals that had some type of diabetic neuropathy and ulcer. And he was utilizing this principle from a skin breakdown perspective of, if there's complete avoidance, the skin's going to continue to essentially become hypersensitized and intolerant to any forces. And then if there's too many forces, there's going to be continued breakdown. And so he used it with a lot of patients that had some type of ulcer, or they had an amputation and now they have a residual limb and there's highly sensitized new areas of the skin. And then he expanded it obviously more broadly to other areas of rehab and conditions, but pretty cool. So any other things y'all want to touch on with either envelope of function or physical stress theory?
Yeah, for physical stress theory, and I do want to say he had a co-author, Maluf, so we'll give shout out to Maluf. They describe some principles in the physical stress theory paper, one being that the level of exposure to physical stress is a composite value defined by the magnitude, time, and direction of stress application, and time factors including duration, the number of repetitions, and the rate at which stress is applied. Another principle that they kind of outlined was that the individual stresses combine in complex ways to contribute to the overall level of stress exposure. And like Sam said, that could be within individual sessions, across time. And then they mentioned like excessive physical stress that causes injury can occur through one or more of the following three mechanisms: a high magnitude stress applied for a brief duration. So like in Scott Dye's work, it was the example of jumping off of like a 3-meter height, so that'd be high magnitude, brief duration. A low magnitude stress applied for a long duration, maybe you're going for an ultra marathon or running an ultra marathon. And then a moderate magnitude stress applied to the tissue many times. So, just wanted to mention that too, because we might come back to some of that with some of the further discussion.
When I initially read these two papers and the concepts, it's nice because they're both relatively agnostic with like certain activities or positions or postures. It's like, what is your preparedness for said demand? And it's not good or bad. It's just, where are you at? So it takes less of a like black and white approach to something, as more so like, what is your current capacity for said thing, which I think can be refreshing and also help patients understand that certain things may not be inherently bad, or you may not be able to do forever or do at this moment, but it doesn't mean we can gradually build up to it. So, Mark, do you want to go into maybe training examples, rehab examples of the Goldilocks principle?
Yeah, I think we can start with training examples. And this is the example that I gave in the blog. I like to present extremes oftentimes when giving examples, because it just helps anchor the discussion, I think, and like hopefully allows us to better understand the nuances. So in terms of, let's say, building muscle, because Sam mentioned atrophy and hypertrophy, if you were to stay in bed and do absolutely nothing, obviously you're going to atrophy. You're going to lose muscle. If you stayed in bed for 2 weeks, you're going to lose a significant amount of muscle. Similarly, if you're someone who doesn't work out very often and suddenly you start training 5, 6, 7 hours a day, every day, and you're just maxing out, most likely you're going to get injured, right? So you kind of have this understressing and this overstressing. So the goal is to try to find that Goldilocks level of stress, right? That Goldilocks or load or whatever you want to deem it, that just right level, so that you're building muscle progressively over time. And we have to understand that this just right level is going to vary within an individual over time, and it's going to vary between individuals. So the stimulus required for me to build muscle might be different than you, Chris, and it might be different than Sam. And that stimulus right now for myself might be different than what it would be in 6 months or a year. And if we bring it back to the porridge example, right, and we're thinking about like, what's the just right temperature for porridge or oatmeal, you know, like I might have a different preference than you, Chris, who might have a different preference than Sam. And if the porridge is 1 degree hotter or colder, that might still be just right for me. Like it's not this perfect, like, oh, it's got to be 92.4 degrees Fahrenheit for it to be just right. It's going to vary. So oftentimes with research, we're looking at averages. And if the people listening have followed any kind of like hypertrophy research, you know that the recommendation for building muscle is often somewhere between 10 and 20 sets of, exercise per muscle group per week. And that's a big range. And that's just the average based on the research, and if we're thinking about this Goldilocks principle again, if you're someone who's untrained, never been to the gym, that actually might be too many sets for you. You might start off with 6 sets or 8 sets. Whereas somebody who's been training for a really long time, they might need 21 sets or 22 sets. So it's just understanding, like from a training example, once again, like the importance of understanding maybe these averages, but still individualizing it to, that N of 1, that person, and then appreciating some of these other factors that influence the ability to build muscle. Now, actually performing resistance training is probably the most important variable, but sufficient protein intake, adequate sleep, what's your stress levels like, all of those things are going to influence your ability to perform in the gym, ability to recover, ability to add on muscle, etc. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Any thoughts on that?
What, maybe a further question of how does someone from a training perspective know if they're underdosing or overdosing? How do they know if they're in that just right range? Besides this kind of research recommendation of this average sets per week, what are ways people can actually know if they are within this specific bandwidth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've worked with people who aren't just interested in rehab. Like, let's say they want to build muscle. I will always ask them to send me their program beforehand. If someone is performing 2 days per week of resistance training and they say that they want to build as much muscle as possible, and I send them a program that's 6 days per week, they're far exceeding anything that they've done in recent times. And that's too much. So you're always anchoring to what you've done. Sam brought up this like acute chronic load type discussion. So that's one thing. It's just like, what have you done? But if you are completely untrained, I'm generally going to aim for the, minimal effective dose. If someone's never trained before, let's get you in the gym 2 days per week, 3 days per week. Start with, well, once again, there's going to be some guesswork. We don't know until they get in there and do it. But let's say we start with a certain amount of sets, 2 days, 3 days per week. How do they feel? What's their level of soreness? How are they sleeping? How are they recovering? Are they progressing in weight? Are they progressing in reps? There's a lot of variables that we can look at, both subjectively, as Sam mentioned, like how are they feeling? Are they just excruciatingly sore where they can't, walk the next day? Are they actually getting weaker? Things like that. I don't know if you guys have anything to add there.
Sam, you have something?
I was going to expand and say I think that Marc's examples are really good, and I think that the concept is a little bit easier to understand when we discuss it through the framework that he applied, using sets as an example. And when you look at it and you asked about like how do we know, at the end of the day, you're unfortunately not going to know until you have applied it and seen what occurs. And that's one of the challenges, because people want to assume that there is like this perfect correct amount, but it's going to be highly variable from person to person for the various things that Marc mentioned. And, whether 9 sets or 11 sets is right for you this week, you might not know until after the week and you get through it and you're more sore than you would like, or you are less sore and could have done more. But at the end of the day, as long as it's within a reasonable range, you'll still have probably good adaptive response to it.
This will go into the more of the rehab context, but when I have an initial exam with patients in the clinic, I'll say, next time I see you in the next few appointments or weeks, it is going to be some trial and error. We don't know how you're going to respond. And over time, we'll kind of find a middle ground and develop some consistency, but it's like setting that expectation of we may have too much of an input with increased symptoms or increased diffusion or increased, muscle soreness, or they feel like they literally had no input and they were super fresh within the next day. So let's go into the rehab context, Marc. How is this different or similar to the training perspective?
Yeah, and I do want to say that all of this sounds simple, and I think to some extent it is, and it should be. I think the problem that often occurs in physical therapy and rehab is that we overcomplicate things. I've been reading the book Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, and I didn't realize that, I guess, a slogan that Apple used or liked was simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. I think it's actually by Leonardo da Vinci. I thought of it when I was reading the book. I was like, oh, this makes sense for this discussion. But, keeping it simple is important. So thinking about, let's start with let's say someone getting injured. What might happen is that you have this 55-year-old male. He hasn't played pickup basketball in 20 years, but he remembers his glory days of playing pickup basketball, goes to the court, plays a couple of full court games, and then, let's say, ends up spraining his MCL, something random, MCL sprained. Then what happens is you might go to a clinic and you come in with an MCL sprain, but you leave with overpronated ankles, 3+ out of 5, hip abductor weakness, and a host of other problems. And while the person might have, weakness of their hips relative to other age-matched individuals, or maybe some other deficits in strength or range of motion, I don't know if we can say that that's the likely thing that was related to their symptoms. It might just be easier to have that conversation, some kind of, Socratic method questioning, and asking, well, when's the last time you played basketball? Well, 20 years ago. When's the last time you ran this long or played this long or did this much cutting? And, it's easier to explain along those lines as opposed to leaving these people with these problems. And like you said, you had this discussion with Mueller and talking about it from like a capacity perspective, preparation is probably a lot more important than structure. You can overcome structure a lot of the times with preparation. So yeah, I think from an injury perspective, that happens a lot. Someone goes, hey, I did the 100 push-ups per day for a month challenge, and my shoulder hurts, and I think it was because of a lack of stretching. Or, hey, I decided to do this couch to 5K program, and now my knee hurts, and it was because I didn't warm up beforehand. And, thinking about this in this kind of Goldilocks principle discussion is probably easier to think about. And then in terms of rehab, it's the same thing. Like you said, we're always trying to find that just right level of activity, where we're not doing too much, where maybe we're flaring up somebody's symptoms, increasing swelling, making their injury worse, but we also don't want to underdose them where they're not progressing toward their goals. And as you've both mentioned, there is going to be some guesswork there. It's, hey, try this out. Let's see how you feel. If you do have a flare up in symptoms, this is where we set expectations. No big deal. That's information for us to know that we probably just need to do a little bit less next time. And if we do a little bit less next time, that feels great. Let's see if we can do that again. You do that again. Okay, let's increase that over time. Two concepts or like graphs that I like that I think originally are from Explain Pain in 2003 maybe, and maybe they took that from somewhere else, I'm not sure. They describe one as this descent into chronicity graph, in the sense of you do some activity, you feel a little bit of pain, and this is maybe people who are a little bit more avoidant, but you feel a little bit of pain and you go, oh no, that's bad, I need to do less. So the next time you do less activity and you feel a little bit of pain, and you go, oh, I need to do less again. And over time, you're doing less and less activity to the point where, you're severely deconditioned. So that might be the case in this Goldilocks principle, where you're doing too little over time. The opposite is this boom bust cycle, people who may be persistent to pain, where they say, you know what, I'm just going to push through it and I'm going to play another game of basketball. And then they flare up their symptoms and now they're incapacitated for however long, and they wait for those symptoms to subside. And then they try it again, but this time they have a flare up in symptoms with less activity. So rather than playing for 60 minutes, they have a flare up with 45 minutes because they've been resting for the past week. And then they rest again and they do it again. And now they have a flare up within 30 minutes. And so same thing, they were trying to do too much. And over time, that also, decreased their capacity or their ability to handle more load. But as I've said, as you've both said, I think the most important thing is trying to find what's relevant to the individual and, manipulating that slowly over time.
Adding to that, Mark, I think another thing that's potentially underlooked, or these discussions don't occur with a lot of patients, is, let's say you've had a procedure, now you're in this subacute rehab process, and you're potentially just looking at that tissue and not the rest of the entire system and organism. And there's no framing of what are the ways we can continue to increase your envelope of function essentially as the rest of your body, and then over time increase that envelope of function or capacity of that said tissue or that specific part of the body. And these are maybe two different goals, where in clinic we have more of this honed in focus on this operative or post-operative rehab process, but outside of it, what are the ways we can have you still feel like you're actually training as a human and increase your tolerance to other stressors? So I had that conversation with a patient 2 days ago who had, I think he was 3 or 4 months out of his Achilles tendon rupture repair process. And he was like, yeah, I just miss back squatting. I was in the best shape of my life. And now I asked him, well, what does your training look like outside of the clinic? And he's like, well, I don't really do much because I'm depressed because I can't squat and snatch. And so he was trying to reframe, how can we increase your psychological resilience and physical resilience with other strategies, as opposed to just going through, like you said, Marc and Sam, this detraining and ultimately like your whole system is become sensitized and deconditioned. So that I think also goes into this Goldilocks principle of what is the right amount for the rest of the organism outside of just this said structure or said rehab process.
Yeah, and I always think about modifying the modifiable, because for every injury, for every instance of pain, there are going to be a lot of possible things that you can modify. We go back to the basketball player. Do we need to work on his hip abduction strength? Do we need to work on his post-hip strength? Or do we just need to slowly expose him to playing more basketball? But for even the person that you're mentioning right now with the Achilles tendon rupture and then repair, we know that metabolic factors play a role in, tissue healing and the state of tissues. And so if someone has been, really inactive, you might be discussing with this guy about, hey, what other, can we get you on an upper, like extremity ergometer, to get your cardiorespiratory system going? How's the diet? How's the sleep? There's always so many factors that we can consider, like you said, beyond just the local tissue. And I do want to come back to the idea of sometimes rehab being overly complex or creating these fragility beliefs. The physical stress theory paper, they discuss the idea as it relates to all the different organ systems. And we think about something like a heart transplant, very, significant surgery, and they get people up and moving relatively quickly. I've had a total hip replacement, and I was up and walking the same day, and they get people walking the same day or the next day and doing stairs. And these are significant surgeries. But then once again, with certain ideas, lumbar flexion, you flex your lumbar spine too many times and you're going to destroy or degenerate your intervertebral discs. So yeah, these ideas are simple, but they're overlooked for, seemingly overly complex ideas that just don't really pan out in the research or don't really follow with what we know about how the body adapts to stress, to load, to these different things. And, we've made some videos. Tony's a wizard at making graphics for like leg extensions, and we did it for like IT band related pain. And, people say, well, leg extensions are bad for your patellofemoral joint. And the question I ask is, okay, well why? And it's because it's more stress when you're at terminal knee extension with the same relative load as if you were doing a squat at that same relative load at the bottom. Well, it's like, okay, well, is a body weight leg extension bad? Okay, how about if I do 2 reps? What if I do 5 reps? What if I do 10 reps? What if I do that with a 2-minute rest? What if I do that? There's all these other factors, but we just boil it down to it's good or it's bad. And there's so much more nuance with a lot of these topics and rehab and training.
Anything to add there, Sam? If not, we can kind of dive into some of the limitations of some of these concepts.
No, I think Marc hit it out of the park.
Agreed. Marc, let's go into some of the limitations or some of the playing devil's advocate for the other side, or maybe things that we initially thought were true from a load and finding this kind of ideal training zone compared to maybe what we are seeing now in the literature.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that injury, pain, your health, it's multifactorial. It's complex. We don't know how all these factors interact. There's a couple papers from 2020, training load and its role in injury prevention, parts 1 and 2. And there were some papers that came out in 2016, 2017 that presented this idea of this sweet spot of training load being between 0.8 and 1.3. Maybe we've, like, I'm not a runner, like I know Sam, you're a runner. Maybe we've seen it in running where it's, hey, don't increase more than 10% volume per week. And there's some methodological limitations with some of these papers, and there's not going to be a perfect sweet spot for everybody for every activity, and it's understanding that. And it really is just coming back to the perception of the person that you're working with. Now, you can probably be reasonable with what you're doing. Once again, if the person's only going to the gym 2 days per week and you suddenly have them going to the gym 6 days per week, that's probably not a very reasonable change in frequency, volume, intensity. Similarly, if Sam's running 20 miles per week, he's not suddenly going to start running 60 miles per week and have a 300% increase in running mileage. And then going back to understanding that the sleep and the stress, and we know that those things play a role in the risk of injury. And going back to this idea of the simplicity is the ultimate sophistication in research. Sometimes we see that they're looking at an outcome, and then they measure 200 variables and they see which variable is related to that outcome. And that's not a good way of, deciding what affects that outcome. Or we see in professional sport where they measure anything and everything possible. And then we're trying to figure out, well, how does that apply to that athlete? What do we actually change? And I think we see it a lot more with just the kind of average person now, probably because of podcasts and social media, where we're measuring everything we can think of with rings or watches or blood glucose monitors. And those are all fine, maybe. But the goal is still focusing on the big rocks. Like, I don't need my watch to tell me that I didn't sleep well last night. Like, I know if I slept well, or I know if I got to bed at a reasonable time. And I know that I didn't sleep well last night. Why not? Because I was tossing and turning. I was awake and I just couldn't sleep. Like, I didn't need my watch to tell me that. So as important and valuable as it is to look at and measure some of these things, yeah, it's probably also just equally as important to not overly complicate it.
Have you had interactions, either of y'all, with patients where they're on that, I'm going to measure everything, I have an Oura ring, I have I'm tracking XYZ on my phone, blah, blah, blah. Do you have conversations with them of what if we measure less, or what exactly they're trying to get out of this data?
Yeah, all the time. Because sometimes what happens too, it's this New Year's resolution where I'm going to get fit, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to do all of these things. And there's so many things to do that it becomes overwhelming and none of them gets done. So instead of you're going to the gym 6 days per week and you're going to cut out soda and you're only going to go out to eat one time per week, right? Those are all modifiable, but are they all realistic? And it's what's realistic for you? You're not going to the gym at all, so why go 6 days a week? Can we start off with 2 days per week? Can we start off with, hey, you normally drink 3 sodas per day. Can you drink 2 sodas per day, right? Like things that are a little bit more manageable. So yeah, with patients, with these different apps and monitoring systems, you can't ask them, like, what are you trying to get out of this? And do you actually need this to do that? Like, what's your goal? I'm trying to get more sleep. Do you need the ring to tell you that you're sleeping poorly? Or can you understand that using your phone until 12 a.m. and then having it by your bedside and reaching for it at 6 a.m. is probably not the most conducive thing to a good night of sleep?
Yeah, I work with a lot of individuals who are after some high performance goals, and as such, they want to track everything in every way. And I think Marc made a really good point there about what do you plan to do with it. And that's one of the most common conversations I have with it, where there's a lot of individuals that, again, with all this technology, they can track so many variables. But number one, is it valid? Is it reliable? And then is it the right thing to then inform adjustments with? For instance, we know that the sleep tracking abilities of most of these technologies are pretty limited. And there's some research that's looked at when someone is informed that they have X rating, it impacts what their own subjective perception of their sleep quality was. Where one research study looked at having people rate their own sleep before being given a score. And then when they were given a poor score, they rated their own sleep worse after that reflection. And so I know myself, I wake up most days feeling quite well rested, and my watch tells me that I am almost always in, like, it says a poor rating. And I don't know why it says that. I personally feel pretty good most days. And similarly, there's another variable, HRV, and again, my watch gives me that. And I'm normally in a I should not train hard almost every given day, and hasn't panned out for me. And I see similarly for a lot of individuals where right now I've got two different clients I'm coaching for Ironman, and both of them have often feedback from their respective HRV that they should have a day off, but they're busy individuals that need to follow a certain format in order to fit it in with the rest of their life, and we basically don't listen to it, and things are going well for them. Could it go better? Hard to say, but the research on listening to HRV in high-level athletes doesn't show that it typically produces better results. So then if we know that a lot of the reliability of the measurements aren't accurate, the validity of them for then informing training isn't probably beneficial, what's the purpose of measuring it? It's just something that can often give people more anxiety to listen to. And that's, I think, one of the biggest issues with, for instance, the numbers Marc said earlier about that sweet spot of training. I think that framework is similar to Goldilocks, like we've discussed. However, the actual numbers that were given aren't from valid measurement systems, and they cannot reliably inform training because we don't see beneficial outcomes of either reduced injury risk or performance from following them. So then what's the point?
I will say too, I'm sure you guys have experienced the same thing. I've gone into the gym, lack of sleep, 4 hours of sleep, feeling like shit. And then all of a sudden it's your best training session ever. Like you hit a PR. It's not ideal, but sometimes that happens. And going back just because it's in my mind, because I'm reading the book, like this stuff is going to apply differently to different people too. Like I'm reading this book about Steve Jobs and their build up to the Mac. And, the author describing how they were pulling these all-nighters to hit deadlines. And while we know that's probably not ideal, that's what was necessary. And maybe that sometimes it is necessary for certain sports or certain activities. Someone is doing an ultra marathon or whatever Ironman, and they got to stay up for 24 hours straight. Like, is that optimal? Like, are you pushing your limits? Are you pushing closer to your injury risk? Probably, but that might be necessary, at some times. But for most people like me, I don't have any specific, like, I'm not trying to do a powerlifting meet. I'm not trying to run a marathon. Like, I don't need to break any specific goals. So my Goldilocks thing is I know what I normally do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And I'm just trying to very incrementally do a little bit more over time. And, that's probably pretty safe for me. Now, if we decided to do a snowboarding trip where we snowboarded for 4 days, like, yeah, maybe I'd be pushing a little bit, past what I might be capable of, but that's the risk sometimes. And that's why we can't always predict these things.
All right. Well, I think that's a good, stopping point, unless y'all have any other final thoughts or subset of topics that you feel like we missed with this discussion.
Check out the shirts.
Boom.
You're going to like them. Guaranteed to increase gains.
Do we have a date on when these are coming out?
No, they're out. They're ready for sale. I don't know if
Awesome.
we're shipping internationally. That would be a Tony thing. International shipping is like we're not making any of the money for shipping. Like the shipping costs are the shipping costs, and it's crazy what shipping costs are. So I think you probably can order internationally, but like no guarantees on the prices, because that's whatever it's set by by I don't even know who it is.
Big shipping.
Big shipping, man. They're always
That's right.
they're always after us.
All right. Thank y'all. Sam, you got something else?
No, I was just gonna make a joke about shipping, but we can carry on.
Okay, we'll call it.
Hey, your shirts are on the way. So any day
I'm
now.
pumped.
Yeah, exactly. Like as far as the international shipping goes, like Tony's testing right now if I even get my shirt in Canada.
And
So,
whether you have to pay an import, it's silly.
complicated.
Chris, you don't have to worry about that. You're here in the States.
True. All right. We'll call it there. Thanks, y'all.